What if the smallest lock is just a mirror for the biggest cage in our heads, and a missing pool key is the confession we never meant to make? What if order is only the costume that fear wears when it wants applause? Tonight, I ask you, when rules claim to protect us, do they actually keep us safe or just keep us obedient? I arrive at the community pool gate holding a towel like a flag of truce, and the metal lock stares back at me with the cold certainty of a verdict I did not consent to. The key is missing, my pocket light, and my breath suddenly heavy, and I feel how a summer afternoon can turn into a courtroom when a hinge refuses to forgive. I tell you this not as a neighbor, but as a witness. A simple barrier becomes a thesis, and the thesis is that power prefers hardware to conversation. On screen, illusion, crossfade, truth. I remember Michel Foucault whispering through college notes, I never finished the panopticon, less a tower than a posture, less a warden than a neighborhood board that learned to smile while measuring our shadows. The sign says hours, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., but what it means is hours. 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. if you belong, and belonging is a currency minted in secrecy and a laminate card. I press my fingers into the chain link, and it bites back, tender and metallic, like a reminder that community without reciprocity is only choreography. Here's the confession. I dial 911 because I need someone to answer for the humiliation of a lock deciding whether I count. Is that ridiculous? Or is it the most honest thing we do, call authority to interrogate a smaller authority so we can briefly pretend we are bigger than both? Cut to black, low hum, security, pulses on screen. The operator asks me to state the nature of the emergency, and I say security breach, which is code for the ache of not being invited to the ritual of chlorine and laughter. You hear me now because I am you when the door will not open and the rule book grows teeth and a sermon. We were told that the HOA bylaws keep the peace, but peace is expensive when it is purchased with silence and gate codes. I want to swim, but more than that, I want the spell to break. And when the spell does not break, I break the hour with a phone call shaped like a hammer. On screen, who decides? The first siren in the distance is not a siren at all. It is a chorus of every petty ordinance and every weaponized newsletter and every meeting minute that called itself democracy while keeping its minutes behind a password. Tell me, how many times have you swallowed your name because the notice on your door stapled you to your own address? The operator asks for my location, and I give it as if I am naming a battlefield where the only casualty is the myth that rules are neutral. I think of Bentham's design, how visibility disciplines the body, and I wonder who is watching me now, a camera blinking, a neighbor peeking, a board member noting my posture like a citation waiting to hatch. Soft push-in, power dynamics, appears, then fades. Across the fence a child laughs, a sound like an amnesty I cannot afford, and I feel the moral weather change from sunny to suspicious. The pool water is perfectly still, a glassy witness, and I realize that calm is often just the surface tension of suppressed questions. Am I escalating, or am I only naming the escalation that was already codified in the architecture of access? The operator asks if there is a threat, and I say, not yet, because the threat is an atmosphere that condenses into a storm only when we dare to breathe too loudly. I pace the perimeter, counting the camera domes like constellations that spell out compliance, and each step writes a footnote in a book I did not choose to read. On screen, order versus freedom. Listen closely. The key is not missing, it is hoarded, and hoarding feels righteous when you can call it stewardship. The board email from last week returns to me like a ghost with bullet points. New security measures, temporary lock replacement, heightened vigilance after an incident. But the incident was a rumor that needed a costume. We pretend that rules are a neutral river, yet somehow they always irrigate the same gardens. I tell the operator that people could be inside without authorization. And what I mean is that authorization is a circle drawn around the chair I am not allowed to sit in. The gate rattles when I test it again, and the sound is a philosophy lecture with bad acoustics. Is it wrong to call for help when what I need is a referendum on who we became while we slept under porch lights and policy PDFs? Hard cut. Truth holds on screen. The siren is closer now, and I feel ashamed and vindicated in the same heartbeat, which is what happens when we outsource our dignity to a patrol car. I end the call with a thank you that tastes like rust, and I wait, towels still folded, a citizen auditioning for the part of adult in control, even as the lock smiles without lips. This is where our story begins, not with a crime, but with the choreography of control pretending to be hospitality, and me, a neighbor named Karen, daring the universe to pick a side. The cruiser glides in like a black punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I didn't mean to write, its headlights combing the chain link with clinical light as if searching for fingerprints on my doubt, and the pool lights answer with a timid shimmer that makes the night second-guess its own thesis about order and belonging. I stand up straighter, the way citizens do when they are about to narrate themselves as reasonable adults in a world that punishes the unscripted, and the officer unfolds from the car with a calm that has been ironed by 1,000 small conflicts, a laundromat of human mess that has taught him to keep emotion on a hanger. On screen, performance dissolve, power, the calm is a costume. It fits him like a uniform and fits me like an alibi, because fear, when asked to speak in public, prefers a blazer to a confession. And tonight I am overdressed in my certainty. He asks what happened, and I recite the liturgy, missing key, possible trespass, HOA memo about enhanced security, pointing at the gate like a witness pointing at a mirror because the culprit and the reflection share a face when policy grows teeth. The radio on his shoulder murmurs civic gossip, plate numbers cross streets, frayed tempers at a liquor store. And for a moment I imagine the dispatch room as a secular church where emergencies are hymns, where our addresses become psalms, where the map is a stained glass window that glows with coordinates instead of saints. Neighbors begin to assemble at a curated distance, phones lifted like talismans that promise proof and provide distraction, the camera red dots blinking like tame constellations that have traded myth for megapixels. And the air thickens with the musk of spectacle. Slow push-in, illusion of safety. I tell the officer I'm concerned about community security, and he nods in the paycheck-required way. Empathetic, but non-committal, while my own nod tries to convince my heart that this is prudence and not hunger for validation dressed as vigilance. He tugs the gate, confirms the lock is engaged, then asks whether I have authorization to be inside, and the word authorization lands between us like a glass wall nobody wants to wipe clean because the smudges are fingerprints of power. I say yes. Dues paid, rules followed, meetings attended where minutes are weaponized into amnesia, and I hold up my lanyard like a passport to a country that keeps moving its border, a paper moon promising access if I pronounce the password without stuttering. He asks for ID, and I feel how identity becomes the first tax we pay when we enter the economy of suspicion, a toll collected in names, addresses, and polite surrender, as if personhood must be notarized before it can be believed. Cut to black, single word. Credential, paper becomes personality here. Lamination becomes morality. The alphabetized roster becomes a secular book of life, where the living are those whose dues cleared by Friday, and the rest are cautions written in the margin. A second cruiser coasts in, and the scene finds its grammar. Subject, verb, object, me, them, gate, while the HOA president arrives with a clipboard that gleams like a shield, as if she has been summoned by the Latin of liability and the soft thunder of potential lawsuits. She smiles with the thin warmth of an email signature, introduces new lock protocols in a tone that could sell both seatbelts and surrender, and I understand that the drawbridge always rises higher when the castle feels small inside. I ask why we weren't notified about the key swap, and she insists there was a newsletter. And I insist that a newsletter no one read is a spell spoken into pillows, a bedtime story for adults who dream of order, but wake to passwords that don't love them back. The officer mediates like a gardener pruning air, miscommunication, misunderstanding, let's de-escalate. And each misses a bandage pressed onto a fracture the x-ray refuses to show because you can stabilize a limb without ever admitting who broke it. On screen, process versus justice. She says she can open the gate now, but that procedures must be respected. And suddenly I am the impatient antagonist in a morality play about patience, the sort where patience always means wait your turn and never share the keys. My voice rises, not to dominate, but to not disappear, because vanishing is what happens to people who treat rules as invitations to talk, and I have learned that silence is the preferred accent of compliant neighbors. She corrects me gently, the way bureaucracy strokes your hair before it counts it, citing section 4.3.2 as if scripture had footnotes about pool furniture, umbrellas, and the correct volume of children at play. The two officers exchange a glance I cannot translate, half empathy, half arithmetic. And I realize authority often lives and looks more than in laws, in gestures that shuttle people into lines without ever raising a voice. The neighbors drift closer, a tide pulled by the moon of possible drama. And I watch community curdle into audience, because sirens convert us from participants to spectators who clap for resolution even when the plot misunderstands the wound. Steadicam circle, spectacle appears, blinks, fades. I tell the president this isn't about swimming anymore. And she replies that everything here is about compliance. And I answer that compliance is what people do when they've forgotten the names of their desires and now call those nameless things safety. The officer asks me to lower my voice. He is right, and he is also deputized by a choreography that rewards me for being quiet while penalizing me for not being heard, and I feel the paradox sit on my chest like a polite cinder block. I breathe a coppery breath and decide to be surgical, because a scalpel beats a hammer when the patient is culture, and the operating room is a sidewalk lined with bylaws that were never peer-reviewed by the people they bind. So I ask whether the key roll out disproportionately failed renters, night shift workers, single parents, linguistic outsiders, or anyone who can't attend the 6 p.m. wine and bylaws socials. And her blink looks like dust entering policy, a tiny irritant that makes the day after the Gateside détente. The neighborhood begins to sort itself like iron filings around a magnet, and I can feel the unseen polls, pro-key, anti-key, pro-Karen, anti-me, aligning with a speed that makes gossip look like physics. On screen, faction, friction, the group chat, once a casserole exchange and lost dog bulletin, mutates into a tribunal where emojis are jurors and screenshots are evidence, and I read every bubble as if it were a fortune cookie cracked open by consequence. Some neighbors DM me gratitude wrapped in caution tape, telling me I said the thing they couldn't risk saying at the meetings where cheese cubes and liability clauses share a plate, while others imply that my call dragged wolves into a garden that merely needed new mulch. I answer no one and everyone, because to reply is to accept the courtroom, and I am already tired of representing my own heartbeat in a space that measures decibels rather than desires. The HOA president posts a formal clarification that manages to sound both merciful and martial, promising process improvements while reminding us that rules, like angels, are most effective when unchallenged. Cut to black, documentation. Floats. Then comes the email about reviewing surveillance footage to close the loop, a corporate lullaby whose chorus is always the same. The camera is neutral, the timestamp is king, the truth is an angle multiplied by pixels. We are invited to a viewing in the clubhouse, which feels like a tiny cinema dedicated to the genre of civil order, and I bring my towel as if it were an amulet again, threadbare but stubborn. The screen blooms with the night before, grainy blues, the familiar rectangle of water, the skeletal gate like a rib cage around the neighborhood's lungs, and my figure pacing like a punctuation mark that won't choose a sentence. The officers appear as silhouettes with purpose, and I watch myself gesture in wide arcs, explaining a wound that refuses to sit still long enough to be stitched, while the president stands in profile like a coin that chose which face to show. On screen, angle is not equal to truth. At 22:03, two swimmers surface in the far lane, and their presence punctures the narrative balloon I had been inflating, authorized, yes, but ghosted by my certainty, and I feel the first crack crawl across my armor like a cool finger. A neighbor pauses the footage and zooms, the pixels obediently becoming squares of doubt, and it's unsettling how magnification pretends to be insight while each enlargement merely renders ignorance in higher resolution. Someone coughs politeness, someone else whispers, "There you go," and the room settles into that smug warmth people exhale when reality rhymes with their prior belief. I should feel indicted. And I do, but I also feel narrated by a machine that does not register context, because the camera can see a gait and a gesture and a laugh, but not a decade of small exclusions that made the lock a thesis instead of a latch. The president uses the laser pointer the way a conductor uses a baton, circling the moment my voice rose, freezing the frame where a neighbor flinched, composing a symphony of cause and effect with all the grace of a spreadsheet. I interrupt, asking whether the footage will also be used to count the times a parent without childcare was denied entry after hours for reasons disguised as maintenance, and the silence that follows is a museum where no one wants to read the placards. On screen, Panopticon, Domestic Edition, the facilities manager, A man who wears keys like a chaplain, wears relics, explains retention policies and blind spots, and the new AI anomaly detector that will keep us ahead of risk, and my stomach becomes an inbox. He says the system flags unusual patterns, and I think about how easily a pattern becomes a person when the person is not acquainted with the right rituals, and how speed bumps get mistaken for trespassers when cars are the only citizens that matter. On the way out, a neighbor approaches with an apology that isn't one, "I get where you're coming from, but you have to admit this got out of hand." And I realize we are both correct and both afraid, which is why we keep talking like weather reports instead of weather. That night, the clips loop in my head, and each replay erases a nuance until the story becomes a gif of my own insistence. And I hate that about memory, how it tar sands the day for usable outrage and discards the clover. I take a walk past the pool, and the water returns my reflection with uninterested honesty, reminding me that clarity is not mercy and that transparency can be cruel when it forgets to be human. Steadicam drift, self-audit. I ask myself whether I wanted safety or vindication, and the question folds into another, whether the urge to call 911 was a flare for help or an audition for control masquerading as concern. In the dark, the camera domes wink like patient stars, and I suddenly see how surveillance seduces the anxious with promises of preemption, how it offers omniscience as a discount replacement for intimacy, how it trades neighbors for users and belonging for analytics. I text a friend outside the HOA bubble, confessing more than I intended, how the sirens sounded like applause, how the clipboard looked like absolution, how the lock felt like a dare, and she responds with a kindness that doesn't excuse me but doesn't exile me either. The next morning, the rumors develop into factions with logos. One group starts a Keep It Tight campaign advocating stricter access. Another launches Share the Pool with handmade flyers blooming like protest flowers on mailbox posts. Kids start asking parents whether the pool is dangerous now, and the parents answer in parent, which is to say they lower their voices and inflate the word fine until it covers everything like a tarp. On screen, myth of neutrality. The president schedules a special meeting promising an open forum while a neighbor posts a spreadsheet of incidents that reads like a horoscope for anxious property values, and the comments become a tide that tries to carry me out to sea. I draft a statement I may never read, a document that admits my fear and names the trap, that calls the footage partial and the policies porous, that invites us to design safety out of trust rather than walls, but I keep deleting adjectives like twigs from a fire I'm not ready to light. By evening, a different video surfaces, doorbell footage of me walking past a house with my phone to my ear, clipped into a meme with captions about Karens and chlorine, and I feel the algorithm lick its lips because it knows a snack when it smells one. I do not cry, not because I am strong, but because I am studying the anatomy of my own certainty, tracing the arteries from wound to worldview, asking myself why a shut gate felt like an existential referendum instead of a solvable mistake. And in that last quiet minute before sleep, I admit that the truth is a crowded room where I am neither hero nor villain, only a neighbor who mistook vigilance for virtue and found, on replay, that the camera does not save us from the work of seeing each other. The special meeting begins like a thunderhead that put on business casual, folding barometric pressure into name tags and lightning into time limits, as if weather could be domesticated by Robert's rules and a coffee urn. Folding chairs multiply into tight rows, the projector warms up with the purr of a bureaucrat's cat, and the sign-in sheet waits at the door like a small border crossing where our names trade passports for opinions and our signatures pledge allegiance to discomfort. I choose an aisle seat because exit routes masquerade as ethics when you anticipate being misread, and because the shortest distance between shame and air is an unblocked path to a parking lot. On screen, open forum, contained emotions. The phrase open forum floats like confetti on screen, yet everyone carries Tupperware lids for their feelings, ready to snap them shut the second truth starts to slosh. The president calls us to order with a gavel that is secretly a wooden spoon borrowed from the clubhouse kitchen, an instrument whose domestic honesty says we are not a court, but we will pretend because pretending is cheaper than hiring a judge. She recaps the pool incident in a tone calibrated for muffins and liability, wrapping nouns in passive voice like fragile glassware. Things were done, concerns were raised, protocols were enacted, so that responsibility can ride coach while optics take first class. A father speaks first, his voice ironed by double shifts, explaining the new key never made it to his mailbox, and how temporary measures fossilize into permanent friction when they always inconvenience the same faces, the same schedules, the same pay stubs. Applause stutters, then stalls because clapping here is a confession. We have learned to applaud with our eyes while our hands stay politically neutral in our laps like timid birds. A retiree counters that vigilance is love and gates are kindness, citing headlines that sleep under mattresses and statistics that tuck in grandchildren, and fear, dressed as prudence, nods along because numbers rarely blush. On screen, fear economy. The words fear economy pulse between us, reminding me that terror has its own currency and interest rate, and that communities sometimes pay premiums on fantasies of control they never actually own. I step to the mic and name myself as the caller. Neither hero nor villain, just a neighbor who mistook the weight of a lock for the weight of a community and discovered, too late, the difference between metal and myth. The room inhales like a single animal, and I offer a confession wrapped around a question. If safety requires humiliation at the gate, do we accept humiliation as the price of living together? And if so, who sets that price and who pockets the change? The projector clicks to a slide labeled Incident Log, a spreadsheet that attempts to sculpt meaning from cells while context evaporates like dew under policy, each row an anecdote shaved until it becomes a statistic fit for a meeting. Someone highlights late-night loitering in red, and a teen raises her hand to say the loiterers were her debate team waiting for a ride after a tournament. The word loitering flushes caught cheating on truth with convenience. The facilities manager extols the AI anomaly detector that keeps us ahead of risk, and I ask whether the model learned from our lives or imported suspicions from elsewhere, an accent that makes us sound guilty in our own dialect. On screen, data is not equal to destiny. The phrase hangs like a caution label. Data can measure footsteps, but it cannot count the kindness that held a gate, nor decode the difference between lingering and belonging. A nurse testifies about finishing the night shift to find the gate locked against her exhaustion, the camera reading her scrubs like a costume for suspicion, and the room offers that soft silence reserved for people who bleed in public without asking for towels. Then a lawyerly neighbor quotes bylaws like scripture, section 4.3.2 blooming again, like a weed that survives every argument, declaring that process is the only compassion that scales because mercy must be laminated to be legitimate. I reply that process without testimony becomes traffic cones around empathy, bright, well-placed, and useless when the road itself is misdrawn, and I feel the rubber tap my shins with polite futility. The president proposes a compromise, reissuing keys after renewed verification, more cameras to plug blind spots, a temporary badge system to soothe insurers, a bargain in which we pay twice for the same door while trust remains unpurchased. The father asks who will verify the verifiers, and the wooden spoon gavel twitches because that unruly question refuses to fit inside minutes, preferring instead to live rent-free in consciences. A woman from Building C admits, voice quaking, that she sometimes prop holds the gate for strangers because she cannot bear to be the checkpoint in someone else's day. Half the room sees a saint, half a liability, and both halves are telling on themselves. On screen, ethics of small acts. The screen whispers that morality is a micro-gesture performed with wrists and doorstops, not just with policies and PDFs, and we all look briefly at our hands as if they might testify. The treasurer warns that insurance premiums will spike if enforcement softens, translating compassion into currency the way empires translate rivers into borders, and the spreadsheet smiles because it has found its favorite verb, monetize. I say into the mic that I will not call 911 again for a missing key, and if emergency must be named, it is the poverty of trust metastasizing between our porches like an invasive vine that thrives on HOA sunlight and rumor rain. The projector bulbs surrender at the worst possible moment, plunging us into a dimness that refuses PowerPoint, and for 30 blessed seconds we see each other without graphs to choreograph our sympathies. A child wanders to the mic and asks whether the pool is still for birthdays. The wooden spoon cannot find a precedent, and the silence becomes a small chapel where practicality kneels before purpose. The president suggests a task force, our institutional way of apologizing without saying sorry, and volunteers are gathered like breadcrumbs for an administrative trail we hope leads to a kitchen instead of a cliff. I volunteer, not because I trust the trail, but because I refuse to let the minutes become the only archive of who we were tonight. Building is slower than burning, but ashes never taught a neighborhood to swim. A neighbor corners me near the cookie table to say I embarrassed us. Another squeezes my shoulder to say I named what hurt. I nod at both because contradiction is the interest we pay on complicated truths. We adjourn without resolution, only a calendar invite, a to-do list, and the fragile warmth of a room that almost told the truth. As chairs scrape and bodies eddy toward the door, I feel the moral standoff settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat I choose to wear because winter is honest. The storm begins like a reminder that nature doesn't RSVP to bylaws, thunder writing its graffiti across the sky with a pen no HOA ever voted on, rain striking the pavement in Morse code for truths we've been too polite to pronounce. I watch from my window as the pool floods over its rim, the sacred lock bobbing useless in water that does not recognize authorized entry. Because rain does not knock, it simply arrives and insists that arrival is reason enough. On screen, control dissolves, fade into truth revealed, lightning illuminates the chain link perimeter, and for an instant I see it for what it has always been. Not a barrier against danger, but a mirror reflecting the fear of those inside, a fence built to quarantine imagination. A figure darts through the storm, a teenager maybe, hood pulled low, slipping past the gate with the kind of ease that makes locks look like jewelry rather than justice, and for a heartbeat my hand itches toward the phone. It would be so easy, 3 digits, a dispatch voice, another report, another siren to sanctify my unease. But the towel folded on the chair reminds me of the night I called and how validation became a narcotic that left me emptier in the morning. The storm intensifies, thunder crouching closer, and the kid cannonballs into the deep end, laughter cutting through the rain like a knife, through bureaucracy, an anthem for the unauthorized that sounds more human than any policy ever drafted. I grip the phone but do not dial, because I realize I am less afraid of trespass than of becoming the echo chamber that mistakes vigilance for virtue. The silence of restraint feels heavier but more honest than the noise of sirens. Cut to black, word appears. Choice is what remains when rules fail, when locks rust, when cameras blink static. Choice is the skeleton key we pretend doesn't exist because it terrifies us with its simplicity. Neighbors peek from their porches, some filming, some scowling, some smiling like accomplices to joy, and I understand how factions dissolve in weather because thunder does not take sides. It baptizes everyone. The president arrives, umbrella trembling like a weak shield, shouting something about liability over the roar of rain, but her words dissolve before reaching ears, bureaucracy washed downstream in a storm that will not file minutes. For once, no one listens because water in the lungs of the community drowns out even Section 4.3.2, and the hierarchy of concern collapses to a single priority. Keep breathing, keep laughing, keep warm. On screen, human first, rule later. I lower the phone, I lower my certainty, and I watch the storm rewrite the agenda without asking permission, reminding me that not all minutes are recorded, some are just lived. The teenager swims until exhaustion and climbs out, soaked, defiant, unpunished, and I realize the absence of enforcement did not summon chaos. It summoned a reminder that sometimes joy is safer than fear. The rain finally wanes, leaving puddles that mirror the streetlights, each reflection a second chance, each ripple an unwritten amendment to our neighborhood charter. I step outside barefoot, the water cold but honest, and my reflection stares back without judgment, no spreadsheet to summarize me, no footage to reduce me to pixels, only the unfiltered self asking whether security was ever about locks at all. The master key dangles from the president's hand like a relic robbed of its aura, heavy now with irony, a symbol demoted to trinket by a storm that proved the locks were never guardians, only ornaments of fear. Neighbors disperse without votes, without motions, without Roberts or rules, and the street smells of ozone and something like possibility, a scent that cannot be monetized or codified but lingers like a stubborn truth. Slow zoom, illusion versus belonging. I whisper to myself that security is not the absence of trespass, but the presence of trust, not a chain link perimeter, but a willingness to open gates before they rust into cages. The officers never come tonight because I never summon them. And in that absence lies a revolution so small it fits in the silence between digits, yet so large it redefines the architecture of my fear. I return inside, towel damp with rain rather than chlorine, and it feels more cleansing than any swim would have, because rain is the democracy of weather, falling on the dues payers and the gatecrashers alike. The following day, the HOA issues a statement about storm resilience, neatly sidestepping the truth that the only resilience on display was human, improvised, and profoundly unauthorized. I do not contest it, because words on paper cannot hold the weight of thunder, and I no longer need minutes to prove what lightning already carved into memory. On screen, redefinition, awakening, the pool reopens, the gate relocked, the bylaws unchanged, but I am changed, and the change is not an apology. It is a refusal to be the stenographer of fear. Neighbors greet me with nods more complicated than before, some hostile, some grateful, most undecided, but all touched by the storm's sermon. That rules without trust are scaffolds without walls, waiting to collapse under weather. I stop carrying my towel like a weapon and start carrying it like a reminder. Softness can resist, absorption can defy, patience can rebel. The kid waves at me a week later, unpunished, unashamed. And in his grin I see a future where belonging is not laminated but lived, where locks are relics rather than requirements. The next newsletter arrives, glossy with the language of order, but I leave it unopened because my scripture is now thunder and my doctrine is now rain, and no bullet point can excommunicate me from that. Final cut. Truth holds steady. And so the story ends not with a citation or a fine, not with an apology or a verdict, but with the humbling recognition that the real emergency was never the missing key, but the poverty of trust we mistook for safety. Security, I now know, is not a gate that refuses entry. It is a community that remembers how to open its arms before it forgets it has them.